obviously there are a lot of people who are troubled, who are bothered by the election results, who are still angered, folks who are upset with what has gone on. They're angry that she lost, and she said you can't give up. You got to stay in this, and I think that is a critical message. And even when President Biden was speaking at, I'm going to play that in a bit, at the DNC holiday reception, when he talked about, kid, you're not going anywhere. He would say the same thing to her, that you have to stay in the fight. It's, the world is not over because she lost the presidential race.
Yeah, you're right, Roland. She's been pretty consistent since the election in terms of highlighting why, obviously it's a broader message for individuals who voted for her, but also she is sending messages to individuals to let them know that she's certainly going to run for political office at some other point. She's young enough, and we just talked about the issue with Democrats and age, but she's part of that, that next generation of policymakers who have a great deal of experience. And so, Roland, yeah, she's telling people to stay in the fight. It's certainly noted in terms of, Black folks throughout our history in this country have faced multiple ups and downs as the fight for racial justice, particularly when it comes to, Black political empowerment. I do want to note, Roland, that, her message is really important, particularly to young voters. But for Black folks in particular, we've been playing at this game in terms of looking for a fair and equitable society for generations. And she highlighted that some people have told her tired. I've talked to a lot of Black folks who are simply exhausted. But I'm highlighting this because we have to talk about the impact that this fight for racial justice, it has on our overall well-being, and we have to acknowledge that. But I do think it's important for Black folks that particularly we need the young Black voters to empower them to run for public office. Certainly, we need to fund those elections. But like I said, I look forward to seeing the path, the journey that, that's laying forward for VP Harris, including maybe for the rumors running for governor of the state of California or other possible, opportunities. But she's right. The fight is ongoing, but we have to recognize the overall impact it has on our well-being.
Well, the thing here, Mustafa, that I think a lot of people need to understand is that this ain't Burger King. You ain't going to always get it your way. And there are going to be fights. There are going to be difficult days ahead. And to me, I think people need to understand that and recognize that, as she said, go spend some time with friends and loved ones and family, get some rest, and come back, get in the fight.
No, I mean, she's exactly right. But I think we also have to have an honest conversation. I'm reminded of the words of Fannie Lou Hamer when she said, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. So for me, what that means is that, yes, we take a moment to recharge, but we also got to start to do things differently. On this show, we continue to highlight for folks of them making the right investments with the right types of organizations who are out there on the ground and not waiting until the last minute. So people get sick and tired of folks continuing to do that. We talked earlier about folks not wanting to create space for younger people to be able to move into leadership positions. So that's another way of burning people out, and they get sick and tired of continuing to knock their head against the wall. So I agree with the vice president about us getting back into the fight. The question becomes, especially for me coming out of a social justice movement, is what does that fight look like? And will my voice be honored in that space? Will the organizations that are out there on the front lines get the resources they need so that we don't have to continue to hit our heads against the wall, because we know how to do the work. We know how to get people energized. We know how to get people engaged in what's going on. So we have to ask that question. Are we willing to finally begin to create these 21st centuries that are so necessary and stop operating from 20th century sort of paradigms that we continue to do? So yes, to the things that the vice president shared. But the question also becomes that when we come back energized, when we come back ready to do the work, will we also be able to put in new systems and new ways of doing things so that we can get the wins on the board? You're not going to win every election. Doesn't matter if it's a local election all the way up to the federal. But we do have to make sure that we are creating an opportunity, a foundation, so that if folks do everything that they're supposed to do correctly, that we can be competitive moving forward.
Well, that's why, Derek, I believe it requires a plan of action. We lost Jim Lawson this year. the architect of the Niagara movement. And I go back to the interview I did with him in 2018 when he said they spent 6 months meeting and discussing why they wanted to do this movement. Then they spent 6 months discussing what they were going to do. I think what we're dealing with now, and look, I get it, Reverend Sharpton and his organization, they're planning this march on January 20th in D.C., King's Day, that's fine. But the thing for me is, when's the planning meeting where you're discussing how you're going to fight? The things that Mustafa talked about. I have long been saying, you know what? You got the DNC picking their chair. Your black men and black women, various leaders, are they going to be sitting down with those folks who want to be the chair and saying, I want to hear from you directly. What is your plan of action? But here's the other piece. I'm not just interested in hearing what white folks what their plan of action is. I want to know what's the plan of action that we're going to hand to them. And so that to me, I think is important. You know, I'm sitting here right now looking at what's at stake in 2025. You've got gubernatorial races in Virginia, in New Jersey. You've got several other critical races. You've got a black Speaker of the House in Virginia. The question is, do Democrats still control the House there as well? I can go on and on and on. So the thing for me is, okay, how do we fund that? See, I'm not interested in just complaining about what resources we did not get in our communities in 2024. I want to know, how then do we say this is what we need in 2025 and this has to happen? Also, how are we also going to fund those things as well? That is what's jumping out at me, and I would rather be on the offense than the defense, and I would rather be reacting in a much more strategic way, as opposed to waiting for somebody to say, hey, now let's talk. No, I would rather be the one said, no, we're talking, meet us on this date.
You know, I agree with you, Roland, but I will also say we got to go more than just planning, right? I can remember I was 6 years old when a meeting took place in Gary, Indiana in 1972, talking about the Black agenda. I remember, Roland, I was 29 years of age at the first Million Man March. Again, there was a plan and put in place. And so, you know, I don't care if we go back to 1972 or 29 years ago when we did the first march in Washington with the first Million Man March. I say we got to have both a political strategy, an economic strategy, and a cultural strategy. As a retired naval officer, I would tell you, Roland, that we don't need to exhaust a lot of time putting this plan together. I'm reminded that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. So I say, let's go back to what Dr. King did in the 60s, where they simply met in the basement of a church and they realized who's going to do what. They had the lawyers in place. They knew that they were going to need some money. And then they put that Montgomery bus boycott into action. I say, let's do what they did in Gary, Indiana in 1972. And they start talking about what we need to do to reduce that gap between white and black families. And so, yes, I agree we need to have a strategy, but the urgency is right now. We cannot wait. We should be planning what we're going to execute in 2025. These upcoming elections a year from now, we should be planning what we're going to do in 2026. When a lot of folks are going to be running at the U.S. senator and Congress and the likes and governor. And then 2028, we just need to knock the cobwebs off, Roland, on some plans that worked effectively 50 years ago.
But the reason I have to push back on that, because I think the problem is those were meetings, those were not plans. When I look at the Million Man March, that was a gathering. There was actually no plan. There was actually no plan that came out of the Million Man March. And then the 10th anniversary, you had almost 400,000 that met. There was no plan. There was conversations about stuff, but there was no plan. 20th anniversary, you had a couple 100,000. Same thing. Conversation, no plan. What I'm saying is, I believe that the mistake is gathering, and then you have to say, well, why are we gathering? I believe a gathering should be to launch something, to announce something, to give people the steps on where we're going. I don't believe in having a gathering just to have a gathering. So when people call me Mustafa and they say, well, Roland, let's meet. I then go, about what? What are we meeting about? Mm-hmm. I then go, who else is going to be there? What are we trying, what's the point of the get together? Listen, they had a White House Christmas holiday reception this morning. I was there, and I got a chance to say a couple of things to President Biden after he finished speaking. And afterward, the people came up to me and they said, you know, there are things we need to do. And I'll go, okay, fine. When is it? Who's going to be there? And then if I go to it, I'm then going to say, okay, what are we doing? I believe that when you look at Gary, Indiana, the Black Political Convention in Gary, the mistake that came out of Gary is that they resolved that the future of Black America was dependent upon a political strategy. They actually left out the economic piece, and that was a mistake. I believe that it was great, it was wonderful that we gathered at the Million Man March. But what happens after that? And how do you keep that going? What is that agenda? All those things that you have to do to keep it moving forward. That's what jumps out at me. And I just believe that when you talk about it now, and like, for instance, I've made it clear to some people, we are still constituents. So what is going to be the Black agenda that's put in front of Trump and the Republicans? Not sit out, but what's the Black agenda? We are still constituents. And so that, to me, I think is what is so critical. And I haven't seen it yet. Maybe those conversations are taking place, but I haven't seen it. I'll be very curious to know what that is, because also I would say from a media standpoint, you're going to need a media strategy to also get the word out about what you're trying to do.
Yeah, you know, so many of us are students of history, you know, and Roland, I've heard you talk about it before, Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? And, you know, some of the things that they talked about at that time. You know, in this particular moment, we have to make a decision. The decision is, are we going to be reactionary? Reactionary means that you don't have a strategy, and whatever this particular administration or your governor or your county commissioner or whoever it might be, whatever they decide, then you are going to react to that and then make some decisions, after they've shared with you what their vision is. We have the opportunity in this moment to do a couple of things. One of them is to make sure that we have our strategy, our action strategy in relationship to the Trump administration. Does that mean that they are going to move forward on the things that we might suggest? We don't know until you be able to move those types of things forward, but we have a good idea of how that would probably be received. The other part of that is, how are we going to make sure that we are putting in place the things that are necessary? How are we going to hold corporations accountable for the sets of actions that they are going to do? How are we going to make sure that we are moving forward with getting the right types of people prepared for the midterm election, and we've vetted them and we've made sure that they understand what our sets of needs are going to be and what our sets of expectations are going to be. We can go down the laundry list of when you're being proactive of the things that you do and you put in place, and then if you're a reactionary, how you get, as Malcolm once said, the crumbs from the table. But it all becomes, sort of apparent once you get the right folks together, make some decisions, make sure that you are hearing from all the other types of folks around the country so that it is not just an elite group of individuals, but it is actually representative of what the people are asking for. And then you can build real momentum around that. And then you talked about the communications, which is critical because you've got to be able to continually feed people what are the steps that are about to happen, what are the successes that are going on, and where are we continuing to run up against certain impediments and how are we going to get around them. But all of that goes down to having strategy. Somebody who comes from the movements that I have, because we never had a huge amount of money, we always had to have strategy. And every time that we've had a success, it's been because we've had that plan that was in place. Everyone understood their role, and they understood what we were up against. And then we just build off of whether small successes or medium or large successes. So if you're not going to do that, then you're not serious about being a real player in the game, and you're not serious about making change inside of your community. And I hope I don't hurt anybody's feelings, but that's just the reality of what it is.
But Larry, it's the same thing that the vice president is going to have to do. The vice president is going to have to take a hard look in the mirror and say, where did we fail? Where did we go wrong? What do we do? She has to do her own autopsy, not only of her campaign, she also has to do that for herself. So, for instance, there's talk that, she's made it clear she's not going anywhere. Okay, what does that mean? Does she run for governor of California in 2026? If she does that, she's not running for president in 2028. Does she run for president in 2028? If she says, I'm not going to run for governor, but I'm going to run for president in 2028, let's just be honest. She's not going to have the perch of the vice presidents. It's going to be an open primary. So now the question is, how do you now confront the negatives? How do you now confront the narrative that has been formed around you and about you? So what actions does she take over the next 1, 2, 3 years that positions her to be the front runner for 2028? And so all of those different things that has to be decided. And I think that it's not as easy as some people say. Like I saw one poll that said, she's polling at 33% for 2028. I'm like, y'all, anything right now for 2028 is utterly ridiculous. But that's what has to happen. And so now the question is, what is her position to come? Does she decide that she is going to be leading the anti-Trump messaging in 2025 and 2026? What's the vehicle in which she does that? Again, all of that requires a really smart understanding of what the plan of action is. And I just think that, again, for African Americans, our agenda is very simple, is how do we still, even when we, amongst ourselves, see, I can't tell somebody you need to vote in 2025 if they didn't vote 2024. I now got to get to why didn't they vote? What is it? Why are they checking out of the process? And so I believe there should be, a listening tour of Black America as well, because we are seeing the numbers don't lie. The last election, the Baton Rouge runoff election as well, the Louisiana election last year, we're seeing where you have significant numbers of Black people, we're sitting out elections and then crying about it after the fact.
So I agree with a lot of the points that you made, Roland. I think that, so there's a couple things here that, yes, Postmortem, the VP Harris has to, with trusted advisors, and, also I would say people who are community centered has to really kind of reflect on what went wrong. And I have some thoughts about that in a second. We do have to, and I agree with you about the listening tour. I think there are a lot of other methods, as a researcher, we need to really dig down and figure out, like you said, why there are less Democrats that came out, particularly, like I said, those minoritized backgrounds. So we need to be in a data collection. That's how I would describe it, in terms of figuring out not only why people didn't show up, but what do they want for the future? It may be very different from what you saw from the Democrats in terms of what they talked about. I don't think it's very different. I think the messaging was off. So I want to be clear about that. The other thing is that the VP Harris is to kind of, thread a needle here. And I want to acknowledge that she ran with two hands behind her back. What do I mean by that? First of all, she had to deal with how racism, sexism, and misinformation intersect. And then she had Biden's folks running the campaign instead of being having an opportunity to hire her own people, right? So she ran with two hands tied behind her back, and against these headwinds, so to speak. I think the other thing is, in terms of VP Harris and what we do moving forward, I think we're already behind the eight ball. And what I mean by that is, I want to go to what Mustafa said about being proactive and then reactionary. Democrats have a tendency to do this. Your point about having a black agenda putting before the Trump administration, that's something we should already have. Okay, if VP Harris wins, what do we have? If Donald Trump wins, what do we have? You have to, the Republicans, one of the things about them in terms of the politics, I've seen this working on the Hill and after, is that we talk about Project 2025, is they're always collecting information and planning when it comes to not just policy, because you get to the policy, it's messaging. How do I message? Listen, it's great if, in terms of student loan relief and some of the other stuff, but how was it messaged? How the Republicans said was, oh, you're giving all these people, all these, rich and middle class people student loan debt, not micro-targeting and explaining in terms black folks are more likely to benefit from that. So we really, and one of the things about this policy issue, we got to focus on the messaging. The Republicans have excelled at it for decades. The Democrats have to play catch up. They have to constantly revise whatever policy and messages they have continuously. You can't pause because you think somebody's going to win. You always have to have updated policy and messaging piece and a policy piece relating to economic issues, et cetera, to reach the masses and to make sure you respond in times of crisis. It's really about crisis management. And the reality is Democrats have not responded to crisis as it relates to what we've seen here in the last couple of years. And last couple of weeks, what Mustafa said is that we're reactionary and not proactive as it relates to messaging and policy.
Absolutely. And I think how you communicate, what you communicate is all critically important, but also, Derek, who you communicate to. It's there. The recipe for winning is there, but you also have to execute that. And there were a lot of flaws, and there were a lot of things that were going against the vice president in this race, and also some of the Senate races. And we have to also understand, take a hard look at, the upcoming Senate races, and many of them in red states, and what that means. How do you flip those voters? But also, I'm looking at black people. How do we get black folks to understand that the couch cannot be an option for us?
You're exactly right, Roland. I know here in Georgia, 3 million registered voters did not vote in Georgia. Of that 3 million, 700,000 of those registered voters that voted in 2020 did not vote in 2024. But we also got to be honest here, Roland. I mean, I heard former President Bill Clinton, he gave his forensic analysis, but I also heard former President Barack Obama gave his analysis, and they were miles apart. Bill Clinton was talking about identity politics. Barack Obama was saying, speak to your base. And so we as Democrats, we got to ask ourselves, do we want to still do this thing called identity politics, where we're trying to have a message for everyone in every way? And I think that's a non-starter, to be honest, because if you look at the Republicans, Roland, the Republicans only speak to one individual. That is the white man. They don't even speak to white women. Whereas Democrats, we're trying to speak to everyone.
Yeah, but you have to. And that's what I say. First of all, listen, the Republicans have it easy. You're right or hard right, okay? And the reality is the Democratic tent is a larger tent. And that's what you have to do. And so guess what? That ain't going anywhere. That ain't going anywhere. So Democrats can complain about, quote, identity politics. Everything in politics is identity politics. Income, education, rural versus urban. That's all identity politics. But the only time they criticize identity politics is when typically it involves race. And then you could say gender, you could say sexual orientation, but typically it's race. What I continue to suggest that Democrats are going to have to figure out, and they're going to have to be honest, Democrats are going to have to deal with this. Democrats are going to have to understand white fear. They're going to have to understand how the buttons of white fear are pushed. They need to perfect example. Democrats are sitting here talking about, oh, we've got to figure out how to talk to these working class voters. You pass the policies. So it's not policy. It's not. The defining point that Democrats can have to confront, it's culture. It's culture. And they have to confront whiteness. And white Democrats are going to have to be honest about this. The Bernie Sanders of the world, they're going to have to understand whiteness is real. Elizabeth Warren, whiteness is real. You've got Tim Ryan, former congressman, he ran for Senate, lost to J.D. Vance. He threw out this dumbass suggestion in Newsweek, oh, we should move the D.C. national office headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Youngstown, Ohio. That's stupid. That's stupid. Because you got crushed in Youngstown. And those white voters in Ohio, they're voting on culture. They're not voting on economics. Because if white voters were actually voting on economics, then it would have been a landslide victory for Vice President Kamala Harris. That's just a fact. And I think, Derek, I just think it's hard for Democrats to want to have to look in the mirror and address whiteness.
I agree with you, Roland. But if you think about, if we're going to do an analysis during that 107 days of her campaign, there were a few areas that tripped her up. Gaza was one, right? And so if you think about Gaza was an issue up in Michigan, right? They were telling you this is an issue. This was an issue in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Wasn't so much an issue down here in Georgia. Down here in Georgia, the issue was talking about the economy. And the sad part is, Roland, Georgia has a very strong economy, but we as Democrats just do not fight back mis and disinformation. We tend to try to take the high road instead of meeting them where they are and get down low with them and say, no, this is a very strong economy. In fact, the economy is so strong, places like Georgia has $19 billion surplus. And the reason why the economy is strong is because the Biden-Harris, they passed, the CHIPS and Science Act. They passed Inflation Reduction Act. The American Rescue Act. They cap insulin. And tell that story that will influence and impact whites, Black, Latinos, Hispanic, and everyone else.
But you were dealing with a situation, and I heard this from pollsters with the Vice President Harris's campaign. It didn't matter what they say. They just didn't believe it. They held nothing against Donald Trump. Nothing. Not the criminal convictions, not January 6th, not COVID, none of that stuff. Didn't hold any of it against him. It just made no sense whatsoever. So, listen, we'll see what happens, but the bottom line is a lot of work to do. As the VP said, let's get some rest, let's recharge, get re-energized, and get back in the game.
Hi, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Fanbase is a free to download, free to use, next generation social media platform that allows anyone to have followers and subscribers on the same page. Fanbase was built through investment dollars from equity crowdfunding from the Jobs Act. People just like you help build Fanbase, and we're looking for more people to help build Fanbase. We are currently raising $17 million in a Regulation A crowdfund on Start Engine. We've already crossed $2.1 million, but we're looking to raise more capital from people just like you that deserve the opportunity to invest in early stage startups without having to be accredited investors. So right now, I'd like you to go to startengine.com/fanbase and invest. The minimum to invest is $399. That gets you 60 shares of stock in Fanbase right now, today. And then use Fanbase to connect with friends, grow your audience, and be you without limits.